Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod. We are excited that you are joining us today. My name is Becky Aiken, and I am here with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Galen Clavio. Good to see you, Galen.
Likewise, good to see you as well.
We talked last episode a little bit about March Madness. So by the time this one airs, it will have started.
Yes.
Early prediction. I know you said you did your first bracket last time.
Oh yeah.
So
I mean, right now, to me, the two best teams in the country by far are Auburn and Duke, but and maybe Houston. I would argue Houston might be better than Duke because Duke's been feasting on SEC cupcakes all year. But God, it's hard to overlook Auburn and how well they've played. I feel like it might be their year, which is wild to think about. That would be a tremendous accomplishment for Bruce Pearl and that group if they were able to win the title.
yeah, that's kind of where I'm looking too. I was even watching a Big Ten game the other day, and just from some of the Big 12 action I've watched, it just seems like a different game even there. So when I watch SEC play, I don't know, it just things seem a little faster in those divisions this year, in those conferences this year.
It is funny because I was watching Indiana Washington a couple of weekends ago, and the commentator was talking about, these are the same officials in the Big Ten now that were reffing Pac-12 games last year, but they're calling like so fewer fouls. Like it's just, and I'm like, yeah, that's the effect the Big Ten has. Like, we just let people massacre each other and then we lose in the tournament. It's just kind of how it works because you're not preparing your team properly for what they're going to face in March. So this is where I like SEC teams. I like Big 12 teams because there's a lot more freedom. It feels like to play basketball in those leagues than what we get in the Big Ten sometimes. So we'll see. This tournament is going to be fascinating. I think there's just so many different aspects to it that are. It's a weird year because there's not really a clearly like Auburn's been amongst the most dominant teams, and yet they don't look that far above everybody else. And I'm really thrilled that we're going to have so many really exciting teams to watch in the tournament.
That's what I love about March.
Yeah.
So, speaking of being March, this is for me around the time of year, especially undergraduate students, but even graduate students are starting to walk into my office and say, what should I do now? I don't know how to job search. I don't know where to job search. I don't even know what job I want to search for. Is that something you experience too around this time of year and maybe more than just this time of year?
I normally experience it a lot earlier, and that's largely because of the program that I run and the emphasis that we give them on the job search process and prepping themselves for careers. So a lot of those conversations with seniors normally for me are happening in like October or November of their senior year, and you'll get some people in at this point, but by this time, at least in my area, most people have already asked those questions. But certainly when I was teaching in sport management and when I talk to people who are in public relations or advertising, this is when those questions really start to pop up since you can see the finish line as a senior. And that's a daunting thing. I remember that when I was in school, it was like, where am I going? What am I doing? I'm frightened. And I had nobody to talk to at that point. At least I'm here for people, I guess, now.
Well, I think that's one of those things as a faculty member, it's not listed in my job description, right? I mean, I advise students, but the assumption is I advise them for what classes to take. And we have a university career center. Most university career centers are super helpful and have a lot of great information and knowledge. But as a faculty member, can have a lot of great information and knowledge, maybe. But as a faculty member, nobody kind of prepared me for this career counselor vibe that I feel like I've taken on for the last 15 years. And I love it actually. That's one of my favorite parts of my job. So I'm grateful for it, but also not, formally trained as a career counselor. And I have a really good friend who runs a career services department at our alma mater. And she's, got a master's in psychology and, has all this knowledge. I'm mostly self-taught, and I think that's one of those things where for a faculty member, when you get the student to walk in your in your office and ask these questions, you need to have done some due diligence outside of your own experience. I mean, the last I hadn't job searched formally, before this KU job for 8 years, and searching for a job in academia does not mirror most normal job search processes. So you have to kind of educate yourself in your field so that you can be able to help them because they're going to come to you, right? Like if you've built that connection, they're going to feel comfortable coming to you. You can send them to the University Career Center, but your next step, one, it's hard to admit you're not sure, and two, you want a trusted person to have that conversation with, and you often just haven't built that with the staff working at the University Career Center.
Yeah, I mean, I got a lot of thoughts on this because I mean, and this is where you and I are maybe not the best representatives to talk about this as it relates to faculty as a whole, because we both, have industry experience. We both are very focused on that aspect of the undergraduate experience, and a lot of our fellow faculty members are not, because they either didn't work in industry or they got into higher ed specifically to not deal with the industry related items. And I understand all of that. But the fact of the matter is, most undergraduate students, whether or not we want to acknowledge it or not, and we talked about a little bit of this last time with the AI conversation, most students go to college with the idea that it is prep for whatever career they're going to go into. That's why, I mean, we don't just have a liberal arts degree. Colleges and universities developed degrees that had names on them. Well, why do those exist? Well, they exist because students wanted to know, if I go somewhere, am I going to be able to learn about this particular avenue? Like, you're not training people as generalists. And what's interesting in higher ed, business schools get a bad rap from other people who are not in business schools as faculty members. Yet business schools operate in their own orbit, and their jobs are to get their students jobs in business, and that's how they're judged. And so they build, like, our business school here, it's an excellent business school. They have an entire career center that is nothing but helping students do specifically this at the undergraduate level. That is not always the case. And what you'll oftentimes get is a situation where faculty don't feel like it's their job, that somebody else should be doing that, but there's not sufficient staffing. And even amongst the places where there is sufficient staffing, there's not sufficient understanding of each of the individual areas the students are going into. So you end up with this double whammy where students, oftentimes when I talk with them, they almost feel hoodwinked because they aren't getting the help that they know that they need, and oftentimes it's not even been addressed until they're a senior, or if it's addressed, it's only in passing, and that creates a lot of tension and consternation among students who are like, how is it that faculty or schools don't think that this is part of their role? And yet you ask the schools and the faculty, and many times they will default to, it isn't our role. But then nobody can define whose role it actually is. And that, I feel like, is an unfortunate byproduct of kind of the long tail transition that higher ed in the US is having, between being something that was very liberal arts focused towards something that has become more vocationally focused. It's just that we haven't had to cycle through of faculty and administrators to acknowledge that and build it in to what the universities are doing.
Well, and there's a world where you can teach people how to think and also prepare them for their next step, for a job, for a career. Like those things can coexist. And this might be an important maybe point where faculty can start to recognize that talking about the options for positions in the field by educating yourself, or if it's more comfortable for you, bring someone in from career services who can talk about what you can do with a philosophy degree or a music degree or a sport management degree if you don't feel comfortable doing it. I mean, at the end of the day, I will tell you, students are still going to come to you for your advice because you are the person that they know, that they've built a relationship with, and that they trust to have the knowledge in the field about what there are for opportunities. So there are some things that you can do that don't take a ton of your time, especially with generative AI, but don't take a ton of your time. to help give students some different pathways. One of the things I did early on when I was teaching in sport management was I created a list for myself of here are the different jobs and the different areas of focus that students would need if this is the thing that they want to do, whether it's equipment management or marketing or sales or events and facilities. So that when they came into my office, we could start talking about, well, what do you see yourself doing? Here are some pathways to get there, and here are some that might make sense for you because I know you and I've seen your skill set. And, I had students all the time come in and tell me, oh, I want to be in sales because they've heard that's how they make money in sport. And then I would say, I understand that and you can try that. But, here are the skill sets that salespeople typically have. Do you like any of that stuff?
Right.
No, you don't like any of it? Maybe not the best option for you. You should try it, but be prepared for the next thing. So, faculty definitely could benefit from taking the time to learn a little bit more if they don't know about the different opportunities, and then just create a cheat sheet document for yourself. And if you want to send it to your students, great. Mine never looked pretty enough to share outside of myself. Um, so, it's just like scribbled notes on there. But that's something that, is a easy way to help support you in having that conversation,
Yeah.
as a means to get started, on top of bringing people into your classrooms who do these jobs, and just give one class period up a semester, just one, and have one person come talk about their pathway and their job. That's a good way to get students, knowledge, and also you then learn from those people, you make notes, and then you're getting, after 3 or 4 semesters, you have 6 different jobs you have knowledge about.
Yeah, I just think this is one of those things that professors and faculty members have got to start acknowledging is going to become a part of what they do more and more. So here at Indiana, under this new presidential administration that we got a few years ago, like they launched into this reactive document, and it was necessary, I think, to look at what the future of the institution was going to be and what we needed to prioritize. And what we came away with from that was this thing called the IUB 2030 plan, or the IU 2030 plan, because it wasn't just about the Bloomington campus. But built right into it was this idea that there's an expectation from students and from parents that we're focusing on experiential education, that we're focusing on career outcomes, that they aren't just incidental. And it's interesting because we've talked in past episodes about campus wide initiatives, and this is again one of those cases where some people were doing that already. I mentioned the business school. We've been trying to build out in the media school our own career services sequencing because, frankly, the the people that were providing that were not providing sufficient, how do I put this? That what was being provided was too generic for media students who have very specific needs in terms of resume materials, in some cases demo reels, and cover letters, what you're applying for, what types of jobs are out there, how they all fit together, how they tier up into higher level positions. So now what the university is doing is creating a bunch of 100 level courses that everybody has to take that start you off at least thinking about those things. And I think for a lot of students, that's the struggle, is that they never have been asked to think about that, at least not consistently. We're taking the additional step of creating a 300 level class that is specific to your career pathway, that's tied into your major, where instead of having faculty teach it, we're going to be tying in alumni who want to get involved with students. This gives them a direct pathway to dealing with students, and it also allows us to work with them on a standardized set of things that we can do across different areas, where it's like, all right, we know, as you talked about, we need to get students thinking about what job do they want to do, and not just vague, like, I've been told the only way to make it in sports is to go into sales, so therefore I want to go into sales. Well, you don't really want to go into sales. You want to get into sports. Well, there's other avenues that you could look at. Sales is just the easiest way to get in because you're making money. Even explaining something as simple as that, and explaining some of those realities, and bringing in guest speakers who are working in different aspects of the industry and having them explain their pathways, and then contextualizing it in terms of what kinds of things are expected by the industry before you get there. In the business school, it's like, well, you're if you probably should have done an internship somewhere, but the things you're learning are very much checking all the boxes of what you need to know in order to be an effective employee. In media, it's different. I have to tell my media students all the time, like, look, your boyfriend or girlfriend or your friend, your roommate who's over in the business school, they're getting job offers and accepting job offers in October or November for the following fall. And they're getting signing bonuses and all of that stuff. And that's not how it works in media. You're not going to get a job offer probably until you've already graduated because they want people that can start right away. You're not going to be able to waltz in there with just a degree. You're going to have some prior experience in student media or in creating your own media. You've got to have a portfolio of work. Now, that's different in my area than it is in, say, like sport management. But, it's also different in public and environmental affairs. It's also different in art. It's also different in, there's a bunch of different areas where there's going to be different characteristics. That's the stuff you've got to get across and have conversations with students about. You can't just assume that they're going to know it or that they're going to learn it on their own. That was always a bad assumption. It was a lazy and self-serving assumption, in my opinion, from faculty. And I say that as someone who 25 years ago could have really used some guidance in terms of where I was going in the career. Nobody at school was willing or able to help because they didn't understand the business that I wanted to go into, and I had to learn it all by myself. Why just accept that that's the status quo has always been my stance. And it's interesting watching the universities slowly start to come around because it's part of the recruiting process. It's like parents and students don't want to go to a university where they're going to get no help on that. And the moment a couple of institutions start doing it, everybody starts doing it because they have to, because that's how you compete.
Well, and you said something that is really important. And I hadn't really thought about the bigger picture maybe before we hopped on the call today, but having whether your department discussions about whether your department needs their own group or in some instances person to help support this because your industry has nuances that are, you can't expect University Career Center to know everything about every industry. And as sometimes as faculty, this is broadly speaking, something that's terrible at universities. We have people with expertise in all these things, and then we hire external people to do the things that we already have expertise in at the university. Same concept, like the broader university career services can have a lot of good general tools and information that might work for a lot of students. It might not work for your students. And if you have a group of faculty who have knowledge in your area, then it might make sense for you to try to create your own set of resources, whether it's courses and not, I think a lot of people build this into their capstone or internship experience. That's too late for most students. It needs to at least happen once earlier. And then, like you said, a 300 level course that's, junior year is probably really the right place for that. Start talking about it in your intro course and then a specific course at the 300 level later. I think that's a really good way forward to think about it programmatically. And then if you can get different faculty to be involved in the creation of that or sit in on it or, gain some of knowledge from the things you're doing already, that's a good way to help prep them to have those one-on-one conversations that are certainly going to come their way.
Yeah.
Or take a faculty member who loves this stuff, who this is like something they're passionate about, and give that to them as part of their load,
Yeah.
right? If you don't have the resources to create an entire career center within the media school or within the School of Professional Studies, fine, because resources are finite. But could you buy out a semester of a faculty's teaching to have them do this as part of their job, especially if they're passionate about it, because they will put in the work to find resources and outline if you want to get a job in, as an academic, that's another one where if they want to go to graduate school, well, do they have support for their specific industry and what going to graduate school looks like and what's the application process? And so I think that's actually a really good way to maybe not fix the lack of preparedness for most faculty to have these conversations, but maybe provide a central point that gives somebody who wants to do this anyway basically credit for doing it. That could be really effective.
It's part of a much larger series of conversations I think we're going to have to start having and are already having to some degree, especially at the R1 level. about what your job is as a faculty member and what counts towards promotion and tenure. This is service, but it's service that's in pursuit of both keeping your undergraduates happy, making your school more attractive, getting more alums out into the field, because that's your donor group for the next 15 to 20 years. That's who you're cultivating, and increasing the connections between whatever your area is and the industry or industries that people are going into. You have to leverage some faculty in this. You may not have that many, but that has to be not just something that they're doing, but it has to be something that counts towards wherever they're going in life. Whatever their pursuit is, it can't just be an extra thing that you do because it's a passion project, but you don't get any credit for. And this is where I think everybody's got to have a little bit of a realization that this is the model that most of these universities are still running on, which was developed 75 years ago, has to change as universities are now in a fight for survival from a revenue perspective. We've talked about the enrollment cliff. That's an issue. And I think it's important to keep in mind that only about 35% of the population goes to college. And then that's all colleges. That's not like R1s. I think it's something like 40% go to college and 35% end up with some kind of a degree. It might be a different ratio than that, but it's less than half of the population. So as those become more finite resources, and as you start to see, for instance, tech companies saying, don't go to college, come work for us instead, because you'll learn everything you need to learn. You've got to do more as a college than simply, or a university, than simply say there is, well, gosh, that's not the business we're in. We're here to teach students how to think. We're not here to prep them for careers, or, hey, we have a career services department, but it doesn't really address any of the things that students really need to know. And you've got students walking into faculty member offices halfway through the second semester of their senior year saying, I don't know where I'm going or what I'm doing. That's not just young people being dumb. That's like, you wouldn't say the same thing about a student walking in saying, I don't understand how to do this equation. That's a fundamental part of what they would be doing moving forward. You'd be like, well, why didn't you learn that? Was there a breakdown in the classes? It's the same thing here. It's got to be something you take into account somewhere in the 120 credit hour curriculum that you're offering people. Like, carving out 3 or 6 credit hours to focus on this stuff isn't a big ask, and you have to put the support structure underneath it to make sure that it's worthwhile information and not just perfunctory.
And we've talked a ton about providing value on the podcast and thinking through what is the value of the degrees that we're putting out there. This to me is one of the most essential pieces of value that we can provide, which is, I know you and I, by the nature of what we teach, likely have a little bit more of a practical or industry perspective. So, I understand that that's the case, but this is the thing that they're coming to us for. Students are not coming to college because they want to learn how to think. Now, they might get that from it, and I hope they do, but they're coming to college because they want to get a job and they see this as a way to learn what they need to learn to get the job, but also support structure to help them get there. And then they end up here and they find out that nobody's going to tell them about what job to do or how to get there, or what is an internship, why should I be doing that, and that is not providing the type of value that they're going to need. And that's something that I can continue to see parents ask the question almost always, like, what's your placement rate? That's their question. They want to know, how likely is my child going to be to get a job when they leave here, because I know how much money they're going to have in debt,
Yep.
and I need to know that there's value here. And I don't know that that changes whether you teach in English or in music or in the business school. The perspective still is, we need an outcome here, and we need one that we know you're going to support.
Yeah. And look, I think for business schools, that makes a lot of sense because most of them have pre-existing like relationships with the industry. And in places where that doesn't exist, and sports management is one of the most notoriously bad places for that, because most sports organization, well, let's be frank, most sport management programs were never taken seriously by the people that created them. They were credit hour mills. Now, there are great programs out there that teach a lot of great things and have great industry connections now, but that's a minority. of the total number. And it was one of the most frustrating parts of me being in that realm when I was in it, because you'd bring this up to faculty and they almost acted like that would cheapen, their reputation amongst other faculty members who weren't in sport management if they focused on like anything other than the conceptual items. And I always found that to be a baffling thing, because like people aren't majoring in sport management to expand their minds. They're majoring in it because they want to work in the sports industry. Now, media is very similar, and this is, the number of people that so I'm not throwing stones here, but with media, it's fascinating because I get parents ask me this question all the time. It's like, what is your placement rate? And I'm honest with them. I was like, we don't track placement rates because to get jobs in media requires more than just taking classes and getting the degree. We are expected to train, whether you're going into broadcasting or writing or social media or film production. We are expected to train you to the point where you can go start working immediately, because the industry has abandoned all pretense of training its incoming employees. So I tell them, I was like, if your kid comes here and gets involved in the myriad opportunities that exist in student media or in production, and they do that for 3 or 4 years, and they try and they network, almost all of those kids get jobs. Like, very rarely do I have a situation where a kid is not in a position to get a job when they graduate if they do those things. But I tell parents, like, I can't force them to do those things. They have to want to do them. And if they get through their 4 years and they do none of those things, it's hard for me to take responsibility for them not getting a job, because we told you up front, this is what you need to do. So even something as simple as that, I think parents respect the honesty, and they respect and understand the idea that, well, that's what my kid's getting into. And this is nothing new. Like, I remember having this conversation with my dad my senior year, like right around this time of year, where he's asking me, so what kind of job are you going to get? And I'm like, well, I'm not sure I'm going to get one, and it was a real shock to him that there weren't just like jobs waiting in media. And I had to explain, like, that's not the way this industry works. It would have been better if someone else had explained that at the beginning. And I think that that's the key element here, is like, be straightforward and understand what you are teaching your students to do and why they're taking it, and incorporate that into the way you're approaching their career development, because you do have some kind of a responsibility there, whether you want to admit it or not.
And most universities that I know are prioritizing experiential learning. And I know sometimes as faculty, you can see that and you're like, what do I even do for experiential learning? What kind of opportunities should our program be creating? If you kind of backward think it and you're like, okay, well, here are the different jobs that are out there. Here are the things they will be doing. Then you can start to create experiential opportunities based on the things they need to be able to do for these jobs. Now, in broader degrees, if you get a degree in psychology, you can, or history, you can be doing so many jobs. There's
Sure.
limitless things you might end up doing. So you might have to make some value judgments about the most likely types of opportunities, or you might have to build broad experiential opportunities that allow students to take it different directions. But the point is creating them, sharing them, and
Yep.
then encouraging students and telling them why they need to be involved in them, and making that, as much as again you might not love it, making that part of your job.
Mhm.
And then we can talk in later episodes about the structures that might need to change on the back end to reward faculty for engaging in those things that aren't written necessarily in your job description, which I might argue should be written in your job description, but maybe we can take out some of the other service that isn't as impactful for student learning.
You mean serving on the merit review committee isn't enough? Yeah.
Well, it all comes back to the goals of
This is
the
this is by the way, folks, this is why Becky and I don't get invited to faculty parties that often. So yeah.
yeah, our perspective on I think it's it takes all kinds. But I
Yeah.
do think that the future of higher education needs to be focused on, great, we're going to bring you in here and we're going to teach you these really important things and we're going to teach you to be critical thinkers and problem solvers. But we're also going to tell you how to translate that into the next 40 or 50 years of your life, or 60 by the time Gen Z graduates. I
Yep.
mean, I think I might even, retirement age might be 75 for me by the time I get there, right? So we can't just pretend like that's not our job. I think that's disingenuous, to be honest, and
It, it
short-sighted.
no, it's not a whole lot different from any business, and higher ed is a business. Any business that ignores the realities of their surroundings and insists on continuing to do outdated things that don't match the culture or the tendencies of what's around you, those are the companies that go out of business, and they get superseded by other companies that do adapt. And that's like, for all of the complaints about, like, distance education, or online education, and how it's not rigorous and all of this, it's like, that's true, but the reality is people do those things because they can do them without spending the huge amounts of money that you're expected to spend to go to an R1. When you get there and it's completely non-career focused in so many areas, and then when someone calls you out on it, you're like, well, that's not our job. Like, that's, you've just got to learn institutionally. This is no one person, this is an institutional thing. And we know higher ed's like, turning battleships turn too quickly to be a good analogy for how higher ed changes their philosophies on things. Like, I could turn a battleship in a day. It takes years to turn like a small amount of policy in higher ed, but you've got to have a more nimble approach, and you've got to start thinking of the relationship with students being far less maternalistic and far more of a service contract between the two parties. I think everybody would do better to understand that and incorporate that into how they're approaching things.
Yeah, as most of you who are listening probably know, could not agree more with that. And just we talked a lot more in this episode. I got to bring us to a close because I don't, everybody's expecting 30 minutes of their time. So I don't want to take too much more of it today. But we talked a lot about bigger structural things that you could do from a programmatic standpoint, but just a couple of final things in those conversations with students that will help support you having them. Try really hard to take a step back about what thinking about what you would do and instead focus on giving them options and take judgment out of it. I've had many students come into my office in March and say, Dr. Aiken, I don't want to go into sports anymore. And
Mhm.
they're like, I was scared to tell you.
Mm.
You got to take personal perspective and judgment out of it and try to provide them support, ask them questions to get them thinking. Those are some simple ways that can help you have those one-on-one conversations and be supportive of your students in the end.
Yeah, I'm all on board with that. I think, and I deal with this a lot. Like, I teach a very niche area, which is sports media. And I tell students all the time, it's like, you may get to the end of this and you may not want to do it. It may not be right for you. I've had some of my best students, my most talented and hardest working, and clearly would be great moving forward. Um, they get into the business, and 6 months in, they're like, I don't want to do sports anymore. So they're doing news now, or they're doing weather, or they move over to PR, and that's fine. And I tell them, it's like, look, A, that's why we try to teach a lot of transferable skills, and B, that's why we try to create a scenario where we are encouraging you to think about the nature of what you're getting into, experience it at this level, and then make value judgments about your own, like, feelings and what you really want to do. Because especially in sports, and I think whether you're in management or media or anything along that axis, most people want to get into it because it seems cool. There's a cultural cachet around sports, regardless of most of the societies that we're in. But the actual work, I always liken it. I may have used this same analogy on this podcast before, but I liken it to, everybody loves ice cream. But what if your job was to eat ice cream every single day, and not just the flavors that you like, but like the really off-brand flavors? I actually stole this from Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann. They wrote a book about their experience at ESPN many years ago. But would you still like ice cream? So I always tell my students, like, if you're going to get into sports media, don't fall in love with sports, because you will fall out of love with sports. Fall in love with media, fall in love with being a broadcaster or a writer, fall in love with production, because you're going to have, you do so much hard work on the front end learning those things, and you become confident in yourself. And you may decide this is the pathway for me for the next 40, 50 years of my life. Or you may get into it and be like, wait, I can have this exact same skill set and make double the money over there. Why wouldn't I do that? and I don't have to cover high school football in, small communities on Friday nights for the entirety of my career. I mean, that these are things I want people to think about. If it's just a launching off point because it helps you learn about a greater aspect of life and about yourself, great. I did my job. If you end up being a great sports broadcaster or a great, somewhere in that, great. That's awesome. But I don't think less of you as a person if you get into this and you're like, I don't really want to do it anymore. That's, I think, a really fascinating thing that a lot of people should think about as we move forward.
Yeah, great points. All right, we are going to end it there. Thank you so much for being here. If you are listening to us on audio, please subscribe, download the show every couple weeks on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whichever platform. But we would really love it if you'd head over to YouTube and subscribe and share us with someone you think might get some value from listening to our show. And we will see you next time.